Hey, welcome to the Modern Farming Podcast, where we bring you insights directly from the field about agriculture, food, and the amazing environment we live in. Today, we're extremely excited to bring you this first part of a three-part series we put together called You Are What You Eat. You may have heard us say that several times in the previous episodes, so I thought it was appropriate to kind of name a three-part series, You Are What You Eat, because we really wanted to dig deeper into a few of those conversations we've had. But we also want to give you, the farmer and the consumer, insight into how nutrients on the farm is constantly changing and how it affects every bite we take. And as always, I'm flanked by Brad Turner and Logan Cutts. And Brad, we spoke about this briefly the other day, but as you were getting ready for this episode and starting to create your talking points, what really stood out to you? You know, what are we doing now on the farm, maybe that we haven't done in the last 20 years of your career, or maybe better yet, what are we getting right on the farm today?
Yeah, Nick, we're just this whole concept of how carbon and biology affects fertility. That our food doesn't have the nutrient content in it did 20, 30, 50, 80 years ago, and and the science behind that is just we're learning more and more all the time about how when you really look at agronomy almost from a biochemistry standpoint, which is very difficult, it's very complicated, but the agricultural world is starting to get a grasp of it, and it makes a lot of difference in the quality of the food.
Yeah, yeah. We'll talk a lot about carbon in just about probably every episode we talk, but carbon's a really big deal nowadays, and I think it's becoming more mainstream on the farm. Several years ago, it, we didn't talk a lot about it. I mean, a decade ago, I don't feel like we talked uh, about it at all. We did a lot of tillage at one point, and I think it became kind of common knowledge that the more tillage you do, you're releasing a lot of that carbon, which I always say is carbon is like the gasoline in the car, right? That's what makes the whole nutrient cycling in the soil. That's what drives it. And so the more of that we can get in the ground. So let me ask you this: what are growers doing today? Whether it's a new technology or a newer technology that you utilize or is out there. I mean, there's a lot of really cool new science, if you will. There's a lot of new data that you and I lean on pretty heavily. But what are some things that maybe we didn't do maybe 5, even 10 years ago?
Yeah, there's a lot of focus on task specific microbes that you can buy. I do a lot of concentration on feeding the native ones, whether it's through cover crops with root exudates, feeding native biology or applied biology, uh, just adding labile carbon or available carbon in the form of whatever a microbe can eat, whether that's I stay away from simple sugars, but there's fish molasses, organic acids. It takes the soil biology to process the elements to feed the plant, not 100%, but for the most part. And microbes are like humans. They need food, water, and shelter, and they have to eat. And they're not going to help your crop until they're full and happy. So, and that's the issue with us lacking carbon in our soils. Not all of it is food available in every form, but until it is, or some of it is, then that biology in your soil really can't give you a lot of help. It's just trying to survive.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of things there. One is obviously that carbon conversation we'll probably dig into on a separate episode, because we could talk. That's a 5 month
Sure.
conversation about carbon, right? But you talked about exudates. If you could, maybe this is kind of a new this is kind of new technology or new information to mainstream agriculture. I mean, those of us in the lab and in universities and all of us who maybe are a little bit more nerdy about the stuff that we do, we've probably talked about exudates for years, but I think it's starting to become mainstream conversation with growers, with suppliers and whatnot. So if you could, maybe Brad, help us out a little bit there. When we're talking about exudates, what exactly are we looking for, or where do they come from? What are we measuring?
Yeah, that's what a plant will secrete out into the soil through its root system to essentially feed biology. And a lot of people will call it sugar, and that's okay, carbohydrates, but there's tens of thousands of different compounds, signaling compounds, different food types uh, in that exudate, but it's actually to feed soil biology so it in turn can go out and do whatever the plant signals it to do and bring back whatever nutrient or compound or amino, whatever that plant needs. And that's how it works in nature. And that's really how it should work in agriculture.
Yeah, and for years, I think like this is a natural process, right? This exudates and root exudates, that's a natural process that happens in all soils, right?
Yes, as long as you have a living plant. If you don't have a living plant in your soil, it is dying.
Right.
Uh, yes, we can pour tons of molasses and fish and kelp and all kinds of goodies out there, but the best and easiest and cheapest way to feed biology in the soil is through a living root, and that's natural, and that's just how things grow in nature.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I asked that is because I think it's it's worth noting that these exudates exist in all of our soil. So there's a lot of times where we look at soil and we're like, oh man, that place is just dead, right? There's no life in there at all. But like you said, even a weed has a root system that's probably exchanging these exudates in the soil. What I'm getting at though is that there are degrees of exudates in the soil, and there are different exudates that, as you said, are signaling different things, which is where this whole idea of measuring root exudates or even paying attention to it gets really interesting, because the data behind root exudates is getting really good. Meaning, we now know what these exudates are doing. So, for example, there are some exudates that are solely in charge of finding phosphorus in the soil or making some sort of phosphorus that's in the soil available. Same thing for nitrogen. A lot of these exudates trigger or signal to the plant to have some sort of defense mechanism. Maybe it's really hot and dry out, and the plant needs to conserve its energy. Maybe it's, as we are today, freezing cold, and there's some stress, compounds in there that trigger that plant or that crop to go into kind of a protection mode. So I think it's really such an interesting science now that I know we're all leaning on really heavily to try to solve some of these problems. One of those, is things like citrus greening or diseases in tomatoes or strawberries. Same thing. We're looking for some of these compounds to maybe help us, and it really takes more time to identify what's going on in the soil for us to really bring some of that into the mainstream. You talked a little bit about these bugs, and whenever we talk about small little critters, I always like to ask Logan, does do bees prefer a crop, like one healthy crop over another? And here's why I ask that. For a long time, we believed that insects attack weak plants, right? And that's still my belief. There are some, even in our universities, who will say a thrip will attack anything. I disagree. I think the thrip's a little bit smarter than we give it credit for, and I do think that it is attacking, would prefer to go after a weaker plant. I'm just wondering, do bees have this same sort of intuition to what's a good plant and what's not, or what's a healthy plant and what's not?
Well, I kind of want to answer both of those. So yeah, bees do prefer plants over others, especially like during watermelon season and gallberry is blooming, which is an ilex. It's native to Florida, so it's a holly. They love it. Produces a great honey, and they get more out of it. So they have preferences, and for fruit bearing trees, they have a large preference towards citrus than they would say an apple tree. So they have their likes and dislikes like we do. And it has to do a lot with the nutritional value. Like for maple, the maple trees, pollen is like a steak to them compared to, you know, pine trees that still produce pollen that we sneeze about for. And it just has such a low quality, but there's just so many pines and oaks that they take it anyways because it's food. And, you know, there is a lot of studies about supplement feeding, and there's a lot of studies about nutrition. And one study I was actually reading this week dives into the necessity for B6. B6 is one of the vitamins that is most prevalent in the royal jelly in the development of the queen. And as far as, you know, your thrips comment, bees like the smell of other bees, and their pests like the smell of themselves. Like small hive beetles prey on weaker hives. One, because the hive is giving off a stress pheromone that smells a lot like the alarm pheromone, that in return smells exactly like the young of the beetle. They give off a pheromone just like bees do. And so I guess to answer it indirectly, certainly other insects like the smell of themselves. So I would imagine a sick plant has more thrips on it than a healthy plant does. And so they're drawn to the smells of themselves.
So
Uh,
interesting. So interesting. I never heard that before. But it makes a ton of sense, right? I mean,
right.
once one plant gets infested, it seems like you can't stop it. It's like, you know, even if you go after it with some sort of heavy hitting insecticide, it still seems like for a period, it seems like everything is happening to that one plant or that one tree, which is really interesting.
Same thing with colonies. I mean, it seems like the ones that are down for the count are kicked when they're down. So it's hard to get the hive back going whenever more beetles are just flushing in and making the situation perpetually worse.
Yeah, and you said that bees do have their preferences, and you said what was it? A maple that is like a steak to a bee?
Yeah, the maple tree is one of our early bloomers here in Florida, and from maple to gallberry to um, many different commercially exploited plants. It all depends on the plant as far as the nutritional value. Our native blackberries, sand blackberries, people hate them. We were using the word weeds, but a weed to someone else in their yard is a beautiful plant to me because the blackberries produce uh, high quality food for bees.
And our weeds are typically healthy. I mean, that's why the weed is there. You know, there was a situation where something wasn't available or something was available that only that plant needed, and that's why they appear. And so they get the nutrition they need. So they're putting out a quality product because that's why they show up. You know, and that's
And you
why
have
they
They're
mate.
bees
opportunistic,
that
right?
even bees that have a larger pool to forage on as far as their diet goes, having a more diverse diet.
Sure.
It's proven in scientific research. I even have it right here. I'll be able to quote it here in just a second. That the influence of landscape actually impacts the resilience to pesticide, and that's from the University of Illinois. So the better the bee's diet, just like us, the healthier the bee is, and the better the bee can fight off the residuals and the impacts that pesticides have on the colony.
Hmm. Yeah, you know, there's been a ton of work with bees and you know neonicotinoids and things like that. Things that we used to spray a lot of in this country. I think a lot of that's been banned and some of those products, mostly because of bees and the fact that a lot of these bees were very sensitive to some of these insecticides. But I think it's really interesting. You know, I whenever we talk about bees, I always think about nutrition, right? Obviously, bees and honey go hand in hand, and so I always think about nutrition. And so, you know, this episode, this first part of this three-part series, where we really want to start to dig into, you know, leading up to the fact that everything we do on the farm, everything we do in every row, whether it's citrus or vegetables, and whether it's Florida or California or anywhere in between, everything we do does have an impact on the harvest quality, right? The nutritional value of everything we harvest. we play a role in that based on what we feed it. Now, there's all kinds of nutrients out there. There's a lot of NPK, which most people are very accustomed to applying. It's kind of the easy button, and then we can dig a little deeper. We can look at micronutrients, and a lot of growers are doing that as well. We can go a little bit deeper and do what Brad loves to talk about so much and apply to his groves that he manages, which is maybe a mixture, more of a biological remedy. In hand, we know we have to use some of these conventional fertilizers, but if you could, Brad, maybe talk a little bit about, how does plant nutrition play a role in the health of our food?
Well, it's everything. I mean, you look at a medicine or a vitamin bottle, and you hear talk of nickel and molybdenum and iodine and these essential nutrients that are in a vitamin bottle. Well, it's in our food, or should be in our food. Oh, the agronomy they'll add an extra nutrient every 10 or 15 years. It used to be 15 essential nutrients to make a plant grow and reproduce, and then it goes to 16, 17, 18. And there's 70, 80, 90 minerals in soil. And I believe probably 99% of those is maybe not essential for it to grow and reproduce and just grow a crop, but for it to produce the ultimate perfect, most healthy crop, it probably takes most of those nutrients. And those nutrients are rock and metal, and plants don't eat rock and metal. Microbes eat rock and metal, and then they feed it to the plant. And that's kind of the easy button on this whole process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
No,
I think key word there is the process of time, whether the breakdown of each thing. And that has a lot to do with bees too. I mean, when I brought up oranges and apples, timing is everything. What does a bee need at that time, and what makes it more attractive to it in that time? All depends on the bloom time. Like in the summertime, water is a high commodity for bees, because not only are bees a living organism, so to coin Brad's phrase, they need shelter, they need water, and what else did you say, Brad?
Food.
They need food. So, in order to be able to find the food, in order to be able to find the water, you have to either provide it for them, or the process. In order to reach the food that they so desperately need, they need to cool the hive down so that the bees have enough energy to leave. So they need water to first cool the hive down, spend less time in the hive so they can go find the food, and then bringing more food allows them the energy again to go find more water. And it's all about what they need in that moment for whatever situation.
yeah, you talk. I love that because it leads right into something I definitely want to talk about that I know we're going to have to dedicate again another longer conversation about. But there is a relatively new kind of idea out there that the way plants are exchanging nutrients in the soil, and it's called rhizophagy. And James White Rutgers.
Rutgers,
Rutgers.
yes.
So he and his team, and if you get a chance, just go ahead and Google it. You might not listen to the whole hour and 45 minutes as I have, but it's really interesting what they have found out. So to Logan's point, what the bees are doing, kind of exchanging these nutrients, and kind of they communicate and tell each other. What's really interesting is what's happening in the plant, the way they're sourcing nutrients has kind of changed the way we think about how we feed a plant. One, plants drink, right? They don't eat. So as Brad said, there's these microbes that have to break these things down. But what's really interesting, what's happening there is that those roots are bringing in different organisms through their roots. They're bringing them in. They're stripping them of all their nutrients, and then for the most part, pushing that back out into the soil to restart the whole process over again. And as Logan was talking there, it just kind of reminded me of that process. And as you picture this happening, it's really an amazing kind of process that is naturally occurring in our soil, which sheds the light on the fact that we need to have really good nutrients in our soil for that process to continue to work. Again, leaning on carbon, because one of the challenges for that whole rhizophagy process is that is driven by energy, and plants need energy. And the easier we make it for plants to get that energy, the healthier and stronger they are, meaning they can put their energy somewhere else to fight off pest, disease, to create more chlorophyll, right? Collect more sunshine. If we could help those plants, trees, or whatever it be, just be stronger and healthier, there's no doubt in my mind that we'll able to, stave off some of these diseases and pests. What's really challenging, I think, and we've had this conversation many times, Brad, is that I don't know if the universities are on board with that idea yet, that we could really, I wouldn't say we could solve all the pest and disease issues for crops with health and nutrition or a balanced nutrition in crops, but I think we can do more than the university believes we can. Do you get that same sort of feeling, or are we missing something there?
Yeah, no, and I talk about that a lot, and it's when you start talking about biology and chemistry together, because the land grant universities just separate it all, and everybody has their area. But when you start talking about biochemistry, then it gets very, very complicated, where 1 + 1 probably doesn't equal 2. It may equal -8 or 16. And it's just a very complicated system. You don't have to know all that to be able to grow using biology and chemistry and carbon, but to understand the science and what's going on is very complicated.
Yeah, and look, I think this is probably the right time to say, look, everybody here on this podcast, Logan, Brad, and myself, and everybody at the Green Gene Foundation, look, we're not throwing anybody under the bus here. It's just there are certain individuals, there are certain universities that are looking a little bit deeper. Dr. White is one of those. Not to say that other universities won't get there, but just up until now, it hasn't been well researched. It hasn't been adopted very well on the farm yet for all the other universities to really dig into it. Do I think they'll get there? Absolutely. Whether they get there or not is not going to change the fact that there's a huge part of this world, or consumers in general, that are looking for a more nutritious food, right? And I think we talked about it last episode, or in episode 3, that over 40% of adults are obese in the US. 20% of children under the age of 19 are obese. And I don't mean to laugh, and we said it before, not everybody gets to choose that, but the mass majority of that 20%, the mass majority of the 40% of adults, they chose that, or they chose not to eat in a certain way for them to have this. And a lot of that comes from processed food, high sugar diets, right? There's the standard American diet that everybody likes to call SAD. We got to face it, right? Our food, the way we grow our food, we could probably do better. And when I say probably, I'm just being nice. We could absolutely do better. And I think there's a lot of really great data, a lot of really great products that are coming out now. I think still the challenge is, how do we get that to be more mainstream, right? The annual cost of obesity in this country is like $170 billion. If there isn't any louder alarm for whatever reason, if you don't care about people's health, that's fine. But who's going to pay for the $170 billion of medical bills for this community to thrive, right? We are. Taxpayers are going to pay it. So I think everybody has a real vested interest in healthier food. And we're certainly looking forward to have more of these conversations about it. There's a lot more going on there than just nutrition, right? There's the whole processed food industry, and really the entire ag system that is designed for efficient production, right? Mass distribution. It's not necessarily intended for human health, and that's just a cold fact, right? And that our industry hasn't really looked at the human health aspect of it. It's looked at, how do we get food from Europe to the United States and still have a quality product? How do we get it from South America to the United States with all the humidity and challenges they have with infrastructure? How do we do that? How do we go from from one part of the world to the next, and it shows up in my Costco shopping cart without a blemish on it. And that's really what the system has been designed to do. Up until now, I do believe, and I'd love your guys' opinion on this, where are we headed? I know, Brad, you and I are doing a lot of the same work on the farm, but there's not enough of us, or maybe I'm wrong. Is there enough of a movement that we think we're moving fast enough in the right direction?
Yeah, and it took us, to have this cookie cutter type, not cookie cutter type of farming where we're just having to push yield and not that much focused on the quality. Uh, we've been doing that for a long time, so we're not going to fix that quickly. I mean, there's always going to be commodity farming. There's always going to be GMO corn. I mean, all that's not going away.
Mm-hmm.
But once enough of this starts and people really can see a difference in the quality of the food, it's like I say, it's not a difficult thing to go more. I don't typically use the regenerative word a lot, but just understanding that it takes biology to grow healthy food and carbon, and there's a million different ways to skin that cat to get that system working. Oh, it's just on the scale that it would have to be done where all of our food is grown that way will take quite a bit of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I'm trying to answer too many questions at one time with this one, but that's also my answer. Is there's just so many problems in every discipline that we face. So, like, to combat the tracheal mite, they were putting solid bottom boards. Everything went from screen to solid because they had this premise that a more hygienic bee was the answer to that problem. But then Varroa came, and it wasn't the hygienic bee that was doing the best. It was the bee that was producing and producing and producing tons and tons and tons of brood. And it was the mass production of the brood that was the answer to combat what was lost with the Varroa infestation. And then small hive beetles came. And then the comfortable apiary that was underneath the shade had to be in the direct sunlight because the beetles prefer the shade over the sun. And so, then there's foul brood, then there's Africanized hybrid species. And, to use, there's no one cookie cutter answer to every single problem. And we try to fit it as finding that, as what the beekeepers call the Herculean bee, the bee that will just solve all the problems. That bee doesn't exist, because we have a European mutt, an Asian mite, an African beetle, a Middle Eastern moth, and a North American environment. It's impossible to find an all-natural answer. And this is Logan speaking. I find it to be inhumane not to treat a bee with some type of chemical application, as it's dying, and to just let it die because you think that you are the Methuselah that's going to live long enough to see the evolution happen. Evolution is going to take hundreds of years, or something absolutely terrible like what happened in Africa to come. And all of their bees died. All of them died except few. And those few are the ones that reproduce. That's how natural selection happens. And we just simply cannot afford to do that in the state of our agricultural industry. We have to feed the masses, as you said. And I find it unfortunate that we have to neglect some nutritional values. And there is a lot of studies about bees and monocultural cropping and how it's bad. But to coin the phrase that Dr. Ellis uses, we have to put the human being first. And it is an interesting complexity. We have to put the human being first by feeding them, but also we want to feed them a good product. And so finding that balance within all these complexities and variables and problems and all these ideologies, how do we find that balance and still produce massive amounts of food that worldwide, if you contribute direct and indirect, it's 13% of the world's population feeding the 87%. If you consider the people like us, it's only 1%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's incredible, the task of world security, not just national security. Because I'm worried about the other nations too. I'm worried about all the people that I consult overseas. How can I help feed that person that's struggling?
Yeah, a very big topic in this country every 4 years is immigration. And I keep thinking the same thing. It's funny you mentioned this, that, we're fresh off an election here, and as every year in the United States, immigration is a thing, no matter what party's taking office. And I started thinking about what are some of the real challenges for people who are immigrating to the United States. Most of these people are looking for a better life, right? They're looking for work. There's a bunch of people doing bad too, okay? But for the most part, they're looking to do work. They're looking to find a better life and send some money home to their family or create a new life here. I would say that's probably the best scenario for immigration that we can have. The worst scenario is what Logan just mentioned. I don't think we've seen anything yet. And I'm not sure if the United States will see it, because we're flanked by Canada and Mexico, and for the most part, they have an industry, they have an infrastructure to move commodities north to south, east and west. When you talk about Africa, when you talk about countries like China and India, these are massive countries with millions of people in it. When they start to starve, they're going to walk until they find water or food, because they're going to die if they stay where they're at. If we have these massive declines in production, or as you say, when bees die on a very large scale, I don't think people fully understand how much work they do. And so I keep thinking to myself, we have a food system right now that is, when you look at it as a system, it's firing on all cylinders, right? When you just look at holistically, like the 30,000-foot view, as I like to say, the system works really well. We get phosphates from overseas, and here in Florida, we get nitrogen from China in truckloads, and it employs a bunch of people on that side of the water, and employs a bunch of people on this side of the water. And then all of us get to go out and sell it and grow a crop. There's a huge economy around our ag system. And there's a huge distribution system to get that from where we grow it here in Florida or California to starving people all over the world. It, to me, though, the real challenge is when we look at the quality of food, or the nutritional value. We could see that there's 100 studies done on nutritional value as it relates to success in later life, or nutritional value and how it relates to education levels. Countries that are starving, peoples that are starving, they are less educated, right? Makes total sense. They would rather go work a field than go read a book, right? Because that fight or flight takes over. They need to survive. And so it's just very interesting to me. And I'm glad to hear you say that, I think we are getting there, Brad. I know there's a bunch of us doing a lot of great work. Every day I open, LinkedIn or my email or something. There's another really great study about, some researcher or some farmer turning regenerative. And it doesn't, you said it, we don't use that word a lot. It doesn't have to be regenerative, right? It doesn't have to be only organic. We could do a lot of good on the farm by just kind of paying attention to the natural processes that happen in the soil, feed that process, let it work hard for us. We could probably reduce our input costs at nothing else.
No, I agree 100%. And I think what'll drive all of this, and I think we've talked about it before, but it's most growers are paid by volume and not by quality. They're paid by the bushel, the pound, the box. And we've talked about bricks in the past, but there are some technologies out there that are coming. And when a housewife can go into a grocery store and have an instrument that puts a blue beam of light on a carrot and get a nutritional value of 3 on this one and 6 on this one and 9 on that one, then you can compare the price. Do I want to eat 3 carrots at at $2, where I'd pay $4 for this carrot that I only got to eat one of to get more nutritional value. And that's what will drive the system. Because to grow it this way is not that hard, but there has to be some incentive for the grower, because he's getting paid. 95% of crops are paid by volume, not by sugar content or quality.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, and we're going to have a guest here in a few weeks, and she's going to talk a lot about that, and that's going to be one of my questions to her. Is she spoke about it before several times? Is who's able to get that food? And her organization is doing some really amazing things to make sure everybody's getting really high quality, nutritious food. Because I do see exactly what Brad's saying. And my concern is that there's only going to be some of us who can afford that. And that's just going to be the reality of it, right? It's not going to be whether they want it or not. It's going to be who could afford it, because there is right now, I think there is a little extra cost. I think we could dial it in well enough right now to where we're not incurring that much more of a cost. And I do believe that industry of biologicals and organics and just more natural processes or inputs will start to become cheaper as they're adopted more, facilities get bigger, reaction tanks get bigger, and we understand it more. I think that cost will come down like in anything. So the cost to the grower will come down, the cost of that food should come down. But in that time, maybe 5-10 years, that high quality food right now is being marketed by, we know one of them up there in Georgia. Individually, they're marketing them, and
Right.
there is a premium on them because they can get it, and they probably had to do a lot of work to convert that farm from a conventional farm to an either organic or biodynamic, or they had to do a lot of work to get here. So rightfully so, they're getting paid. I would just hope as we move forward that the price of these things come down, and somebody's looking at how do we get nutrition to everybody, because I really do believe that it's going to benefit us all, right? Like I said, nutritionally dense children are very bright children, and they do really great things. They create really great industry, they create really good patents, they do great things in later life. And I think that's what keeps a country going, right? I think that's what keeps us strong, and that's what keeps the world's population very strong. So, hey, guys, I know we alluded to our guest here. I'm really excited about we're going to do this one more time before we bring her on. But thanks everybody for jumping on again with us tonight. Look, I didn't mention at the beginning, but if you want to learn more about the Green Gene Foundation and all the wonderful things they're doing, they've had an amazing month. We're only in month 1 of the year here, and every day I open up my Facebook or my Instagram, I see another post, what they're doing. They're doing amazing things. So if you want to learn more about the Green Gene Foundation, please jump on the web at thegreengenefoundation.org. And while you're there, click on the podcast button, and there's an email list you could sign up for. That's not a spammy list. All we want to do is let you know when the next episode of Brad, Logan, and Nick are on, and you'll be the first to know. So if you could check them out, as always, we're there thankful to the Green Gene Foundation, everybody, and all the work they do for us. Guys, let's do this again in a couple weeks, and have a great week, and we'll talk soon.
Take care.